My name's Emma Dawson, and I'd like to start today by acknowledging that we're gathered again on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and pay my respects to elders past and present, to any First Nations people in the room with us today, and for those of you joining us from home, to the elders of the country from which you join us. We acknowledge that it was and always will be Aboriginal land. We had a fantastic day of conversation yesterday. I'm feeling quite energised. I don't know if many of you heard Ken Henry on the radio this morning, but it was terrific to hear that message getting out more widely. And today's a little different in focus. Yesterday was very much about the social services side of the ledger. Today we're looking at particularly at what we need to do globally and in terms of our environment to push forward those benefits of the net zero economy and ensure that we have a socially and environmentally just future for our children. And so I'm delighted that this morning we're being joined by Dr. Katherine Trebeck to give us our opening keynote for day 2. Katherine leads the Next Economy's economic systems change work at the moment. Next Economy, of course, is one of our partners in this event. She's a political economist with roles including writer-at-large at the University of Edinburgh, consultant to the Club of Rome, strategic advisor to the Centre for Policy Development here in Australia, and she was the 2024 Thinker in Residence at the Australian Health Promotion Association. Katherine co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and she instigated the group of Wellbeing Economy governments. It's a pretty big achievement and is making a real shift in how we think about the world. I'm delighted she's with us today. Please make her very, very welcome.
Hi, morning everyone. Hope you're really doing well. I'm so honoured to be here. This is a really timely gathering. And I want to start by, do you want me to hold it? Okay, thanks. I want to start, of course, by also paying my respects and appreciation to First Nations communities here in and around Australia. I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. And I think underpinning the conversations we've been having the last few days, of course, is the reality that Australia's huge financial wealth and the inequalities we've talked about is on the back of stolen land and unpaid rent. And so that's something we've got to really keep in our minds. I want to also pay huge thanks to Emma and the amazing team at Per Capita, because this is really great fun. I've been a bit of a sponge over yesterday, soaking up all the incredible wisdom and really learning, because I think it's through equipping ourselves with a lot of the knowledge that people have been sharing yesterday, we can start to take these conversations out to wider audiences. So thank you to Emma and the team, and congratulations on the coverage, and also thanks to all the other speakers who I've been soaking up your incredible wisdom. Like many others have said, I'm not a tax expert and I'm not an economist, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about the way the economy meets the needs of people and planet. And I want to talk to you about how tax can play a role in enabling a different economic system that's much better aligned with what people and planet need. And just picking up what Fran said yesterday, I spent almost 20 years living in Glasgow, so I'm very, very happy to talk about class. I think we really need to. And so let's definitely go down that conversation too. So what I want to cover is, I'm not really going to critique the Australian tax system. Others have done that really well, and I know you've got a session coming up led by Mark very soon around the international tax dynamics. I will just say, if you've get time, jump on YouTube and look up Bill Nighy's ad that he did a couple of years ago for the Robin Hood tax campaign, the financial transactions tax. And it's a beautiful encapsulation of the sort of changes that can be done to the international tax system. That was when created by my colleagues at Oxfam at the time. So what I am going to do, though, is really look at how the economy looks like today that taxes have to deal with, and also the role of taxes in creating that economy. I want to break down 3 functions of tax, look at how the economy that we need, that tax could help create, and then really look around the world for inspiration that proves it's not just desirable, but it's eminently doable. Yesterday, we heard a lot around how the extent to which the economy externalises. When I talk about the economy, I talk about how we provide goods for each other, how we treat the environment, the nature of business models and who's winning and who's losing, all those dynamics of the economy as a provisioning system. But one really key characteristic of this economy is its ability, even enthusiasm, to externalise costs, to put costs, impose them on a third party rather than take them into account when decisions are being made. I think you'll all have different examples that illustrate that. The International Monetary Fund for many years has been tracking the extent of subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. And in their recent analysis, they said that implicit and explicit subsidies add up to about $7 trillion a year, which is enormous. But I think really critically in this point around externalities is that they say 60% of those subsidies, so they're taking a broad definition of the term subsidies, 60% of those subsidies are implicit. So it's not government saying, here, fossil fuel company, have a wodge of cash. It's costs that other people are picking up, whether that's the local hospital having to treat kids' asthma, whether that's the local council having to clean up the river, and so on and so on. Those subsidies that basically, because actors in our economy are so darn good at making other people pick up the damage. My favourite example is an ad that came up from a recent airline, a big airline recently, where they've done the analysis and they've said that it is actually cheaper to get the plane from Edinburgh down to London rather than getting the train across Scotland to Glasgow. Now, this upsets me, not just because Glasgow is a way better city than London, and why would you want to go to London when you could get the train to Glasgow, but because it's a blatant example of the extent to which those airline costs are not taking into account the environmental impact of flying the plane down to London. And the result of that I don't need to tell this audience, is that we've got huge overuse of natural resources and we are pumping way too much greenhouse gas emissions into our climate than our planet can handle, and that is resulting in what Antonio Guterres is calling the era of global boiling. Last year, of course, was the hottest on record, and just earlier this month we saw 2 academic studies published saying that our world has passed 1.5 degrees of the Paris commitment. And of course, though, it's not just climate and carbon and methane that we need to worry about. An economy with its tendency and habit and obsession with externalising is almost automatically this throwaway economy. And we see where nature is treated as a sink. And the result is that we have our oceans, our rivers, our glaciers, and our bodies riven with plastic that others have thrown away, not taken into account. It's also an economy that is not paying people enough to live on. And we heard a lot of this really, really powerfully yesterday from various panels, and particularly the lived experience panels at the end of the day. It's not helping people keep up with the cost of living. And we see that when more and more people living in tents, in doorways and under bridges in our capital cities. We see that in rising levels of food insecurity, people turning to food assistance, people skipping meals. Casey was telling us yesterday that people coming to Anglicare food relief, as she called it, is poverty is going up the income chain. There are more and more people who are in work, essential workers, needing that emergency food relief. People are delaying medical treatment. But at the same time, it's an economy that enables others to accumulate and hoard a hell of a lot more than they will ever need to live well. Cass yesterday was talking about the amazing analysis that the UNSW and ACOS do around wealth inequality and poverty. One of the statistics that they come up with that I think is very, very powerful, because Australians love a league table. Congratulations, we are the top 5th in the world in terms of the number of high net worth individuals, ultra wealthy people. We're 5th in the world. We've got over 140 billionaires here in Australia. And part of that, and again, this was discussed really well yesterday, it's because we've got an assetized economy. Taxes enable that, but taxes also have to grapple with that. And so bring that together, and we've got a situation where more and more people are feeling stressed, anxious, feeling out of control, lonely, depressed, blaming and othering other people, and we see rising levels of polarisation. People reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox and at the ballot box. So how can we do things differently? And this is where the wellbeing economy idea comes in. This is a growing agenda of all sorts of different people around the world saying we have to design an economic system that very, very deliberately, purposefully meets the needs of people and planet. I'm not actually going to go into this in a hell of a lot of detail here. You can ask me about it later. But essentially imagine an economy that has its purpose of taking care of people on the planet, is much better at about preventing harm happening rather than spending a shed load of money downstream after the fact, repairing, fixing, healing after damage has been done. It's also about pre-distributing. I know we've talked a lot about redistribution, but it's about designing market outcomes so that they deliver a better balance of resources in the first place, and it's about people power, making sure that people are at the forefront of decisions that impact them. Fran nodded to this yesterday and said I would talk to you about growth. I'm not going to go into that either, other than just to say it's also about being much fussier about growth, rather than having this sort of blind obsession that thinking if we just grow the economy big, measure it by GDP, that will automatically fix everything and create good lives to people. We have tried that recipe and it didn't work. The wellbeing economy agenda is about saying, what do we need more of in our economic ecosystem because it's good for people and planet? What do we need to power down because it's not aligned with what people and planet need? Just to give you a sense of what those changes might look like, I just want to share this quote from you. These words said, ensuring good lives and long-term sustainability will likely require fundamental changes to how governments allocate resources, so we talked a lot about that yesterday, and how they design policies. It's about government investment. Again, we talked about that yesterday. May need to focus on enabling people to flourish throughout their lives. It's also going to require broader transformations in a range of sectors, for example, on how firms arrange their business models. And that's really what I want to talk about today. The reason I'm sharing this quote is because of who it's from. It's not from Warwick or I in our papers. It's from the OECD, late last year. And I just share it to give you a sense that this conversation, this recognition that we need to really fundamentally transform our economies is starting to move outside halls like this into very, very mainstream institutions. So I think this is a little chink of hope, but I'm going to share with you a lot more. Because businesses, really thinking about what sort of businesses do we need more of, is about going beyond this sort of carte blanche, the business community. It's one of my least favourite phrases. Recognising actually that the business community is an incredibly diverse pool of folk, some who really represent 20th century ways of doing things, treating workers like just-in-time inventory. And then there are others, nicely from Scotland, but some here as well, as I'll show you in a minute, who are really rolling up their sleeves and saying, how can we be part of a positive response to the challenges the world faces? How can we use our commercial viability to contribute to the outcomes that people and planet need? And so critical in this is a really nuanced conversation around the role of business. It's about embracing those that are good for people and planet, and then having a really honest conversation about powering down those that are not aligned with that. And the good news is that there is a ton of really cool examples of businesses that embody this. So one of my favourites is this one called Green City Whole Foods. They're a Glaswegian company. They've been around since the 70s, so they're doing something really well. If you go into any health food store or sort of bougie cafe in Scotland, you will see their yogurt-coated chocolates or their dried thyme or their cans of chickpeas. They are across the supply chain. They're a worker cooperative. They're owned by their workers, and their mission is to take care of their workers and to reduce their footprint and to have more local supply chains. This is Fairphone, which is a Dutch company. Some of you might have heard of them. They are really challenging the idea of planned obsolescence, the idea that one tiny thing breaks and we have to throw it all away. So their model of their phone is modular. And I used to have one when my camera in that phone broke. They sent me a tiny little screwdriver so I could fix the camera and keep going with my phone rather than throwing it away. This is an Aussie company. This is in Sydney. This is a restaurant called WEAll. And their mission, they say, is that to really reuse everything. Everything you touch in their restaurant, they say, would have gone to a skip. So they've salvaged what they make these beautiful cocktails out of, the food that they're using, even those trendy tables you can see are Tupperware that counterparts in the food industry would have thrown away. But it's bigger companies as well. So this is Triodos Bank, who I bank with in the UK. They're a B Corp. Their idea is really to channel investment and credit to activities that we need more of in our economic ecosystem. They're very deliberate about who invests in them. They make sure that no single financial investor dominates so that they can have that independence and freedom to be the sort of company they want to be. This is another Scottish company, Faith in Nature. Again, if you go into any bathroom across the UK, chances are you will see one of their conditioners or their shower gels. What's really interesting about Faith in Nature is that they have appointed someone to their board whose job it is to represent nature. So at every board decision, you have someone there whose brief it is to stand up for the impact the company might be having on the planet. This is a really familiar brand to a lot of people. What's really exciting is that it's America's oldest and biggest farmers co-op. Over 700 farmers. It works for the benefit of those farmers, not remote shareholders. It takes an ethical approach. It really embraces having diverse teams, which is very important in the US at the moment, and it's all about regenerative agriculture. And just finally, again, all of you will have something, I promise you, from IKEA in your house somewhere. The interesting, I hate going to IKEA, but what I love about it is that it's owned by a Dutch foundation. And so it takes a long-term approach to its business, and its mission is to get funds for that foundation to undertake work on poverty and climate change reduction. So these are different examples of different business models that show a different way of doing business and doing the economy. So how can the economy help us get there? I think there are really three critical functions of tax. And we've heard a lot about these first two yesterday. First one, of course, is transferring, so redistributing from wealthier to those with not enough to offset market inequalities. The next one is allocation, and that's using that revenue to invest in the sort of public services that we talked about so richly yesterday. The final one is, and I'm being a little bit cheeky here, is around using tax as a lever to expand the pace of the transformation to a better economic system, to one that meets the needs of people and planet. How can tax be an enabling tool to help us bring about that transformation? And the good news is that there are a ton of examples from around the world. We see proof of concept in what different governments at all different levels are doing to use tax to try to change the economic ecosystem in their jurisdiction. I'm blatantly cherry picking here because these are not the rule. What these are the pioneers that prove that it's not just desirable, but it's eminently doable. So one example is in Sweden, to bolster the circular economy, they've reduced their VAT, their goods and services tax essentially, on repairing goods. Another one is in Canada, is where they've jacked up the price on things like luxury cars. I'm not quite sure why Ken Henry had a dig at taxes on luxury cars, because I think it's a good thing. Let's tax the hell out of luxury cars. On boats and private jets, really starting to say, let's use taxes to encourage activities we want more of, like repairing goods, and let's also use it to power down and disincentivize gravitating to activities like private jets, luxury cars, and so on. In Portland, in Oregon, in the US, they have said to companies based there, okay, if you want to pay your CEOs a shed load more than the average worker, okay, go ahead, but we're going to tax you. And the tax that they're charging, and they're using business licenses, because that's a tool that level of government has, they're using business licenses to jack up the price if that ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay goes up again. So they're really disencouraging that level of intra-company inequality. They're using the funds to invest in homeless services. Other governments are starting to do this as well. Spain just recently has brought in a solidarity tax on very, very wealthy Spaniards to support cost of living measures across Spain. This is beautiful Bologna, which is the capital of the Emilia-Romagna region in northern Italy, one of my favourite parts of the world, because the economic ecosystem is made up of worker cooperatives. About a third of that area's GDP comes from worker cooperatives. And you see the results there. Decent gender equality. It's one of the wealthiest cities in Italy. Proud record of political activism, and it's been resisting those public services cuts and high levels of median wages. So how have they used tax as a lever to start to create this sort of economic ecosystem? They're using tax to give signals, to change incentives, and to educate business advisors around what sort of economic models are needed in that local economy. And so what Italy has done is things like they've lowered the rate of corporation tax on social cooperatives, they've lowered VAT. If they're employing disadvantaged workers, they've come to an arrangement around lower national insurance. They've got tax relief for donations going into those social enterprises, and they don't tax trading surpluses when they're reinvested in the firm. Really good example of using the lever of tax to encourage the sort of business models that we need more of in our economic ecosystem. I want to take you now to the UK. Say what you want about the current UK government. I'm very happy to have a conversation about their form later. And yes, Rachel Reeves has rolled back addressing the issue of non-DOMs in the face of fierce hysteria from the wealth industry. But still, what they have done is they have reduced tax breaks on, or they have increased taxes on, or they've created new taxes on various activities that I think are starting to change, starting to get towards a different economic ecosystem there. So, for example, reduced taxes on inherited pensions, something we were talking about yesterday with super being transferred. They have reduced tax on capital gains tax on profits from investment properties and financial assets. They've raised taxes on private jet travel, which I just think is utter no-brainer. And again, we picked up this conversation yesterday. They're increasing taxes on private school fees and the buildings that those private schools have. Just finally, I want to look at how tax can be used to change the public realm. In Wales, they were facing a huge problem of second homes that was leading young people to be unable to afford to live in their cities. People were leaving, huge housing crisis, and over-tourism as well, because a lot of those second homes were being farmed out to Airbnb and so on. And so what they did is they've raised council tax quite punitively on second homes, and that has resulted in quite a substantial fall in the number of second home ownership, particularly in Cardiff, where the problem was particularly acute. Scotland is also on the case on this. Their land and buildings transaction tax has a very, very steep increment as you go up the value of your property as you buy it. So it's essentially, if we take homes as a rough proxy for financial wealth, it's a very progressive wealth tax. They've also brought in what they call the additional dwelling supplement, which sounds better when you say it with a Scottish accent, promise you. But that again is like what Wales are doing, basically saying, yes, if you need to have your second home, fine, but we are going to tax you for that, again, because of similar problems of Scotland's local communities, its towns, its villages, being left empty by people having their holidays and their second home. And then I really like this one, Montreal was seeing the sort of local public realm dominated by car parks. So they said, we're going to increase the tax on outdoors, non-residential car parks. It's encouraged people to go underground with their parking, and they're using the revenue they've got from that for public transport. Again, starting to use tax as a lever to change how the economic ecosystem is created in the area. We've heard a lot yesterday, and per Capita's recent tax survey, which I think is incredible, valuable contribution to the conversation in Australia, that people are up for this. These are some additional figures I want to share with you. Partly I collect these because they give me a bit of hope that the conversation is moving and there is public appetite for these shifts. But across the G20, well over 2/3 of adults saying they are supporting taxes on wealth and on businesses and carbon and progressive taxes on income and using them to start to change how the economy operates, to invest in the activities we want more of. Yesterday, someone suggested that we had a billionaires lived experience panel. If you wanted the good news story, you could invite folks like Patriotic Millionaires, folks like Millionaires for Humanity, the Tax Me Now group, who are really actually saying, yeah, we know we're wealthy, you should be taxing us more. And at Davos just last month, we're not in March yet, just last month, they coordinated a letter of over 370 millionaires saying to the folks at Davos, this is absurd that we don't pay more tax. So the conversation is starting to move further there too. And I really love this final quote I want to share with you from the Australia Institute that say 7 in 10 Australians agree with the phrase that taxes are what we pay for a civilised society. So the conversation in the public and the willingness in the public, as at least shown up in these polls, is there. People get it. And yet our governments are still very, very shy on making the changes that are needed. And so I think what is needed now is to turn these sorts of statistics and opinion poll support into heat that the politicians feel so that they are ready to stare down those vested interests, so they feel that there's a sufficient countervailing force that they can push through that hysteria and the pushback that will come from the vested interests, because we know it will come. We need politicians to have more than just opinion polling. We need them to feel the heat. And that's why I think this conversation and hopefully the next stages after it are so incredibly critical in turning this public sentiment into political heat on politicians so they feel ready to stare down those vested interests. So Emma and your team, thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
A few questions coming through for you, so we might just sit down and do that before our next panel. I've got one to start with, if that's all right. It's my privilege, showing. As long as you're aware of it. As long as you're aware of it. So much of the work that's being done in Europe and the UK is really inspiring. How does that translate? And I know you and Warwick have thought about this carefully, and he's joining our panel next. With Australia's 3-tier system of government, we've talked a lot about federal issues, we've talked a little bit about state government, but there's a role for local government here too, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think what you saw in the examples I showed is that no matter what level of government we're talking about, there are levers that level of government can pull, whether it's Montreal with their parking tax or Wales with their business rates or Scotland, which is devolved, so it's roughly equivalent of an Australian state, using their land and building transaction tax and their additional dwelling supplement. So I think it would be great to have all governments feeling that they can look and almost do an audit of what levers and instruments they have, whether it's licensing, whether it's rates, and it's also what they celebrate as well. You know, where do politicians go and cut the ribbon? You know, what are they launching? I think all of, you know, where do they bring that largesse and that attention? So different layers of government have a hell of a lot that they can do to start to think about changing the economic ecosystem. And one of the really great, I guess, movements in Australia is that community wealth building agenda, and Bill and Annie are here who are part of that conversation around building the sort of economic activity from community upwards rather than waiting for trickle down. But that requires that local governments use things like procurement, licensing, you know, ownership, you know, what sort of firms make up our high streets? Are they just more and more sort of betting companies, or they are, you know, the generics high street, or are they locally owned firms? They're the sort of questions that local governments can be asking. But there's also only so far that local can go. And I think that's why it's really appropriate that we do train the spotlight on the federal level, and as Mark will be leading the conversation later, around the international level as well, because we've seen already Trump pulling back from the OECD's multinational tax, some around, the unilateral corporation tax. So that matters as well.
Thank you. I think there's going to be a big focus in our green paper on the role of local government as well as those other levels. So very important to note that conversation. Question here, of the samples you've noted, such as Scotland, what were the drivers to get government change? Was it campaigns or through the ballot box or combination?
Yeah, so I know Scotland better than others, and partly Scotland is good at talking about class. Scotland has huge health inequalities, which people are very, very aware of. There's been, over the last 20 years, a sort of growing movement of various diverse actors, whether they're unions or churches or environmental groups or social justice organisations or disability groups, starting to point out that it's the economic system that is the root cause of the various issues that they're all trying to address in their different ways. And they're starting to come together to say to the Scottish government, you've got to move away from this narrow focus on just competitiveness and growing the pie and measuring yourself by GDP. You have to have a much richer, broader conversation around what the economy is about. And then it's also about finding champions inside government too, who get it. And political leadership really matters, but political leadership can be a real blessing and a curse. What you also need is to have what I'd say policy entrepreneurs inside government, the bureaucrats, the civil servants, who are just finding ways to roll up their sleeves and implement this too. And CPD has a paper coming out shortly called Embedding a Wellbeing Approach into Government. That's going to be a really important document for those policy entrepreneurs to figure out how do you translate these issues into tangible shifts in how government operates. So the campaigns matter, the insider track matters, the political leadership track matters, and then it's perhaps the less glamorous work of holding government to account for the implementation, because often the implementation bit is where the action is, or the question is, but the action is lacking. And so also, really making sure these things are enforced robustly really matters too.
Thank you, and I'm going to ask you now to turn that into some specific advice for us. Obviously, what we're trying to do here is not just build awareness, but build a movement for change in our economy. We heard from Ellie yesterday that we should focus on storytelling. What are your tips for our group as we move ahead?
Yeah, so I think individual stories are critical because it's quite a nice attribute of humans, isn't it? That statistics really just, they're not what penetrate our guts. It's human stories. And I think that's a beautiful characteristics that humans have. We respond to individual stories. That's what elicits empathy and compassion. And so harnessing that, but also we need proof that it's possible. And so that's why some of those examples I think are really critical, and others like them. Governments will want to see the policy proposals, the statistics, the work you're doing, the polling, all of that matters. But I really think it is about heat on politicians. I collect opinion polling from around the world around various aspects to do with a wellbeing economy, and basically because I'm usually pretty depressed about the state in the world, and so I like having a bulk of documents that people get this. But it's patently not enough. And as Frances Moore Lappy, who's an American scholar, says, why is it that we are collectively creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want? And I think that speaks to the real paradox between what folks, when they really recognise what most matters to them and to their family and to their future, have real common goals, and yet we have designed collectively through a series of policy choices over the years that you heard about from Alan Kohler and Ken Henry and others yesterday, we've designed this economic system that is so profoundly misaligned with what people planet need and what they want. And partly that is because of how incredibly locked in this system is by those who win out of it. The great systems thinker Donella Meadows talks about success to the successful. They can change the rules of the game to lock in this system. And so when I say we need a countervailing force, I'm really serious. Because opinion polls are not enough, evidence is not enough, even having great data is not enough. We need the politicians to feel the heat. So campaign's going to be utterly critical, and I'm up for helping, Emma.
Thank you. We've got the numbers at least. I just have to ask this one last question because it's whoever sent it's very cheeky. How do I become a thinker in residence? Not me.
Just keep thinking and stroking your chin and be resident somewhere.
Well, we're delighted to have your top thoughts and top mind with us here today. So thanks again so much, Katherine.
Thank you.